The forest was alive with the kind of stillness that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. It wasn't my first hike, not by a long shot. I've been through some gnarly terrains before, but something about this one was different. It was early autumn, the leaves had just started turning, and the air had that crisp bite, the kind that's supposed to make you feel alive. But here, in the dense woods on the edge of some no-name town, it just felt off. The trailhead had been barely marked, just a faded wooden post with an arrow pointing into the trees. No warnings, no maps. That should have been my first red flag, but I had driven 2 hours to get here, and I wasn't about to turn back. I had read about this place online, some obscure hiking forum where enthusiasts shared hidden gems. Beautiful views, one post had said. Totally worth the effort. Just don't go alone. I brushed that last part off. People were always spooking each other for fun. I had my gear, water, and a solid GPS app. I wasn't worried. The first hour or so was uneventful. The trail was narrow but well-trodden, winding through groves of towering pines and oaks. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden patches, and the forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. I passed a stream, its water clear and fast-moving, and paused to refill my bottle. Everything seemed normal. But then, as I moved deeper into the woods, the trail started to change. The dirt path turned rocky and uneven, and the trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining overhead like a cage. The light dimmed, and the air grew colder, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. My GPS still showed the trail as a thin red line, but I noticed it was lagging slightly, the little blue dot struggling to keep up. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just poor signal. Still, a nagging unease began to creep in. The first real sign that something was wrong came about 3 hours in. I'd been climbing steadily, the incline burning my legs, when I stumbled upon a clearing. It wasn't on my map, but that wasn't unusual for these kinds of hikes. What struck me was how unnatural it felt. The trees around the edges were bent, their trunks twisted as if by some great force, and the ground was littered with broken branches. In the center of the clearing was a massive boulder, its surface scratched and gouged as though something with claws had tried to climb it. My first thought was bears, but there were no signs of tracks or scat. It was just wrong. I didn't linger. The unease was building now, a tightness in my chest that I couldn't shake. I checked my GPS again, but the screen had frozen completely. No signal. That's when I realized I hadn't seen a single marker or blaze on the trail for at least an hour. I turned back the way I'd come, hoping to find something familiar, but the path seemed different, less defined. The trees pressed in closer, their shadows long and menacing. I kept walking, trying to stay calm. Panic is the enemy in situations like this. I knew that, but as the minutes turned into an hour, it became clear that I was lost. My compass, a trusty backup, was spinning wildly, refusing to settle. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and I still hadn't found my way back to anything resembling a trail. That's when I saw the cabin. It wasn't marked on any map, and it definitely wasn't mentioned in the forum post. It sat in a small hollow, half hidden by a thicket of brambles, its wooden walls weathered and gray. The windows were broken, their frames gaping like empty sockets, and the roof sagged in the middle. It looked abandoned, but in the fading light, it felt more like it had been forgotten, swallowed by the forest. I hesitated at the edge of the hollow, my instincts screaming at me to stay away. But the logical part of my brain argued that it could be a hunter's cabin or some kind of shelter. If I couldn't find my way out before nightfall, it might be my best option. I made my way down, stepping carefully over the tangled roots and underbrush. The closer I got, the more wrong it felt. The air around the cabin was colder, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, and the smell of damp wood and mildew was overpowering. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking on its hinges as I pushed it open. Inside, it was dark and musty, the floor covered in a thick layer of dust and leaves. A single wooden chair sat in the corner, its back broken, and a small table leaned precariously to one side. There were no signs of recent use, no footprints, no discarded cans or wrappers. Just silence. I didn't plan to stay long. I just wanted to gather my thoughts, maybe check my GPS again. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. On the far wall, partially obscured by shadows, was a series of deep gouges. They were too high up to have been made by an animal, and they formed no recognizable pattern. Just jagged lines crisscrossing like some kind of desperate scribble. My stomach churned, and I backed away, nearly tripping over the uneven floorboards. Outside, the light was fading fast. I knew I needed to find higher ground, someplace where I could get a signal or at least orient myself. I climbed out of the hollow and started moving uphill, my breath coming in short bursts as the terrain grew steeper. Every now and then, I thought I heard something behind me. The crunch of leaves, the snap of a branch. But when I turned, there was nothing, just trees and shadows. By the time I reached the ridge, it was nearly dark. The view was supposed to be spectacular, but all I could see was an endless sea of trees, their tops swaying in the evening breeze. No sign of civilization, no distant lights, just emptiness. My phone was dead by now, the battery drained from constant searching. I sat down on a flat rock, trying to calm the rising tide of panic, and that's when I saw it. Far below, in the direction I had come from, a faint light flickered through the trees. It wasn't the warm, steady glow of a campfire, but something colder, more erratic, like the beam of a flashlight. Relief washed over me. Someone else was out here. Maybe another hiker, maybe a search party. I shouted, waving my arms, but the light didn't stop. It moved slowly, weaving through the trees like it was searching for something. I scrambled down the ridge, keeping the light in sight. As I got closer, I started to call out again, but something stopped me. The way the light moved, it wasn't right. It didn't bob or shake like someone holding a flashlight. It glided, smooth and deliberate, cutting through the darkness with an unnatural precision. My stomach sank. I crouched behind a tree, my heart hammering in my chest. The light stopped. It hovered in place for what felt like an eternity, then started moving again, this time faster, zigzagging through the trees. It was coming closer. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The light passed within 50 feet of where I was hiding, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a shape behind it. A tall, shadowy figure, its movements jerky and unnatural. But then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I ran. I don't know how long or how far, but I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out beneath me. When I finally stopped, I was at the edge of another clearing, the moonlight casting long shadows across the grass. In the center of the clearing was another boulder, identical to the one I'd seen earlier. The same gouges marked its surface, deep and angry. My stomach turned. I spent the night there, curled up against the base of a tree, clutching my pack like it was some kind of shield. Sleep was impossible. Every rustle, every distant crack of a branch sent my heart racing. I kept expecting to see that light again, weaving through the trees, but it never came. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the canopy, I forced myself to move. My legs were stiff, my throat dry, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. I headed east, following the rising sun, and after what felt like an eternity, I stumbled onto a dirt road. I don't think I've ever felt such overwhelming relief. A passing truck stopped to pick me up, the driver's face a mix of concern and curiosity. I told him I'd gotten lost, left out the rest. I never did figure out what I saw that night. I've told myself it was just my imagination, the result of exhaustion and fear. But every now and then, I think about those gouges, about the way that light moved. And I wonder if something in that forest was watching me, something that didn't want me there. All I know is, I'm never hiking alone again. I never thought a simple day hike could turn into the most harrowing experience of my life. It was late September when I decided to explore a trail that had been on my list for a while. The weather was crisp and clear, perfect for a hike. The trail, nestled deep in a national forest, was known for its stunning views and solitude. I was eager to escape the noise of the city and spend the day surrounded by nothing but trees, rocks, and the crunch of leaves underfoot. The trailhead was about a 2-hour drive from my house. I left just after sunrise to make the most of the daylight. As I pulled into the small gravel parking lot, I noticed only 2 other cars. It gave me a sense of reassurance. I wasn't completely alone out here. Slinging my pack over my shoulder, I started down the path, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail wound through dense woods, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking views of rolling hills blanketed in autumn colors. I stopped frequently to snap photos and take in the scenery. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of squirrels and the distant calls of birds. It was exactly the peaceful escape I'd hoped for. About 3 hours in, the trail began to climb steeply. I checked my map and realized I was approaching the most remote section of the hike. This part was less maintained, with narrower paths and occasional fallen trees to navigate. It was here that I noticed something odd. The woods, which had been alive with the chatter of birds and the rustling of leaves, were suddenly silent. Not just quiet, but unnervingly still. I chalked it up to the altitude or maybe my own heightened awareness now that I was farther from civilization. Pushing the thought aside, I continued on. The climb was grueling, but the promise of a panoramic view at the summit kept me motivated. The trail twisted and turned, and I focused on placing one foot in front of the other. As I ascended, the air grew colder, and a light mist began to settle over the trail. The sunlight, once streaming through the trees, was now dimmed by the thickening fog. It was around noon when I reached the summit. The view was as incredible as I'd hoped. A sea of orange, red, and yellow treetops stretched out before me, framed by jagged cliffs and distant peaks. I found a flat rock to sit on and pulled out my lunch. As I ate, I tried to shake the nagging feeling that had been building since the woods fell silent. It felt like I was being watched, though I saw no sign of anyone else. I told myself it was just my imagination. Solitude can do strange things to the mind, and I wasn't used to being this isolated. But even as I packed up and started back down the trail, the feeling persisted. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone or something following me. There was nothing, just trees and fog. About a mile into my descent, I came across something that made my stomach drop. A shoe, muddy and worn, lay in the middle of the trail. It looked like it had been there for some time, the laces frayed and the fabric discolored. I bent down to examine it, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. There was no sign of its owner, no footprints leading away, just the shoe, abandoned and out of place. I straightened up quickly and pressed on, my pace quickening. The mist was thicker now, muffling sound and making the woods feel even more claustrophobic. I tried to focus on the trail, but my thoughts kept drifting to the shoe. Who had left it, and why? The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The trail seemed different somehow, like it was subtly changing. Familiar landmarks from my ascent were missing, replaced by features I didn't recognize. At first, I thought I'd taken a wrong turn, but my map showed no other paths in this area. The logical explanation was that I was simply tired and disoriented, but logic was doing little to calm my nerves. Then I saw it. A second shoe, identical to the first, lying a few yards off the trail. My breath caught in my throat. This one was upright, as if someone had stepped out of it mid-stride. The ground around it was undisturbed, no sign of a struggle or even a footprint. I didn't dare approach it. Instead, I snapped a quick photo with my phone, the act of documenting it somehow grounding me in reality. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I became aware of another sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The crunch of leaves. It wasn't the random rustling of the wind or an animal. It was deliberate, rhythmic. Footsteps. My heart pounded as I strained to pinpoint the direction. The mist made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, and the sound seemed to echo, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I called out, my voice cracking. "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. The footsteps stopped. I stood frozen, every muscle tensed, listening. The silence was deafening. Then, just as I was beginning to convince myself I'd imagined it, the footsteps resumed, closer this time. I didn't wait to find out who or what it was. Adrenaline took over, and I bolted down the trail. My pack bounced against my back as I ran, branches scratching at my arms and face. The fog was disorienting, but I trusted my instincts, following the faint outlines of the path. All the while, the footsteps pursued me, matching my pace. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like an eternity, my lungs burning and my legs screaming for rest. Eventually, the trail began to level out, and I recognized the split where the main path looped back toward the trailhead. Relief surged through me, but I didn't slow down. Not until I saw the parking lot through the trees did I finally dare to stop and look back. There was nothing. No figure emerging from the mist, no sound of pursuit, just the quiet forest and the oppressive fog. I stumbled to my car, fumbling with the keys, and threw myself inside. Locking the doors, I sat there, trembling, my mind racing. Only then did I notice the photo on my phone, the one I'd taken of the second shoe. It was blurry but clear enough to see what I hadn't noticed before. A faint outline in the fog, just behind the shoe. A figure indistinct but undeniably there. I didn't wait to analyze it. I started the car and sped out of there, not looking back. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, and I've never returned to that trail. I've told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light and the fog. But deep down, I know better. Something was there, watching, following, and it let me leave, but just barely. I've always loved hiking. It's my way of escaping the chaos of city life and clearing my mind. The sound of my boots crunching against gravel, the cool breeze rustling through the trees, the occasional chirping of birds. It all feels like therapy. But after what happened last fall, I've started to question my love for it. It was early October, the air crisp but not yet biting, and the leaves were starting to turn vibrant shades of orange and red. I planned a solo hike along a remote trail about 2 hours from where I live. It was one I'd done before, but this time I wanted to take a lesser-known path that branched off about halfway through. I'd read online that it was more challenging but offered some stunning views at the summit. The idea of conquering it excited me. I arrived at the trailhead around 7 a.m., the sun just beginning to rise. The parking lot was nearly empty except for an old pickup truck parked in the far corner. I strapped on my backpack, checked my gear, and made sure I had enough water, snacks, and a map of the area. My phone had a decent charge, but I knew better than to rely on it. Reception in these parts was spotty at best. With everything set, I set off, the trail winding through dense forest. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was well maintained, and the weather was perfect. The scent of pine filled the air, and I found myself humming a tune as I walked. By the time I reached the junction where the main trail split off into the lesser-used path, I felt confident and energized. A small wooden sign pointed the way, the lettering faded but still legible, Raven Ridge. The path was narrower and less worn, with overgrown bushes encroaching on the edges. It was clear this wasn't a popular route. The trees here were taller and denser, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into scattered beams. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. I felt a mix of excitement and unease, a reminder that I was venturing into the wild. As I climbed higher, the trail became steeper and rockier. My legs burned with effort, but I welcomed the challenge. After about an hour, I reached a small clearing that offered a breathtaking view of the valley below. I took a break, sipping water and snapping a few photos. The horizon stretched endlessly, the rolling hills blanketed in autumn colors. For a moment, I felt a deep sense of peace. That feeling didn't last. About 15 minutes after resuming my hike, I noticed something odd. The trail, which had been faint but discernible, started to fade. At first, I thought I'd missed a marker or a turn, but after backtracking a bit, I realized I hadn't. The path simply grew less defined, as if it hadn't been used in years. The trees grew closer together, their twisted branches forming eerie shapes. A faint sense of unease crept in, but I brushed it off. I'd studied the map beforehand and knew this path eventually looped back to the main trail. I just needed to keep going. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. The forest seemed darker, the air heavier. The usual sounds of nature had faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. My unease grew, but I pushed forward, convincing myself that I was overthinking. After all, it was just a trail. What could go wrong? Then I saw it. A single hiking boot, half buried in the dirt. It looked old, the leather cracked and weathered, laces frayed. My first thought was that someone had lost it, but as I stood there staring at it, uneasiness gnawed at my gut. Why was it here in the middle of nowhere? I glanced around, but there was no sign of anyone. The forest was still, almost unnaturally so. I considered turning back, but pride and curiosity got the better of me. I told myself it was just a boot, nothing more. People lose things all the time. I pressed on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The trail continued to deteriorate, eventually disappearing altogether. I relied on my compass and the map to navigate, cutting through underbrush and stepping over fallen logs. My progress was slow, and I started to feel the strain in my legs and back. The sun, now hidden behind thick clouds, cast a dim light that made it hard to gauge the time. I checked my watch, 3 p.m. I needed to find the loop soon or risk getting stuck in the dark. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound, coming from somewhere to my left. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It could have been anything. A squirrel, a bird, even the wind, but it sounded deliberate, like footsteps crunching through leaves. I scanned the trees, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but I saw nothing. After a few tense moments, the sound stopped. I told myself it was just an animal and kept moving, but my senses were on high alert. The rustling returned, louder this time and closer. I stopped again, gripping the straps of my backpack tightly. "Hello!" I called out instinctively, my voice sounding small and shaky. No response. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The dense forest that had once felt peaceful now felt suffocating. I quickened my pace, no longer caring about the trail or the view. I just wanted to find my way back. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees like silent sentinels watching my every move. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my breathing shallow and ragged. Panic was setting in, and I struggled to keep it at bay. Then I saw it, a makeshift campsite. It was little more than a fire pit surrounded by a few scattered belongings. A torn sleeping bag, a rusted tin cup, and a weathered backpack. Everything looked old and abandoned, as if it had been left there years ago. But what caught my attention was the fire pit. The ashes were fresh, a thin wisp of smoke curling upward. Someone had been here recently. I called out again, louder this time, but the forest swallowed my voice. My gut told me to leave, but curiosity held me in place. I approached the backpack, my hands trembling as I unzipped it. Inside were a few random items: a flashlight, a pocket knife, a water bottle, and a notebook. The notebook was worn, its cover stained and torn. I opened it to find pages filled with scrawled handwriting, some of it legible, some not. Most of it was mundane, lists of supplies, notes about the weather, but one entry stood out. Something's not right. I've heard things at night, seen shadows that don't belong. I'm not alone out here. My blood ran cold. The handwriting was shaky, the words hurried. I shoved the notebook back into the bag and stepped away, my instincts screaming at me to leave. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I turned and started walking, then jogging, then running. My only thought was to get back to the main trail. As I ran, the forest seemed to blur around me, the trees a dizzying maze. I stumbled and fell more than once, my hands and knees scraped and bleeding. The rustling sound returned, now accompanied by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps behind me. I didn't dare look back. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding like a drum. When I finally broke through the tree line and onto the main trail, relief washed over me like a wave. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I ran until I reached the parking lot, my legs barely able to carry me. The old pickup truck was gone, leaving my car the only vehicle in sight. I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat there shaking, my mind racing. I don't know what I encountered that day. Maybe it was just my imagination, the isolation playing tricks on me. Or maybe someone was out there watching me, following me. Either way, I haven't gone hiking alone since. The wilderness, once my sanctuary, now feels like a place of danger and uncertainty. And every now and then, when I close my eyes, I hear the rustling of leaves and the crunch of footsteps, and I wonder if I'm truly alone. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon as I pulled into the empty trailhead parking lot. I'd planned this solo hike for weeks, carefully choosing a lesser-known trail deep in the forest. It was supposed to be an escape from the noise of life, a chance to clear my head and reconnect with nature. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of leaves and damp soil, and the only sounds were the rustling trees and the occasional chirp of a bird settling in for the night. I strapped on my backpack, double-checked my water supply, and started up the narrow dirt path. The trail was well-marked but uneven, winding through dense woods that seemed to close in tighter as I went deeper. I could feel the temperature dropping as the sun sank lower, but I welcomed the chill. It felt invigorating, a reminder that I was alive and far from the chaos of daily life. About an hour in, the light was almost completely gone, and I switched on my headlamp. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trail just enough to keep me on course. I'd always loved night hikes. There was something about the way the forest came alive after dark that felt both thrilling and calming. The sounds of nocturnal creatures replaced the daytime birdsong, and the air felt heavier, carrying a sense of mystery. But tonight, something felt different. It was subtle at first, a faint unease that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed taller and darker than usual, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms. Or maybe it was the silence. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. No rustling leaves, no scurrying animals. Just the crunch of my boots on the trail and the occasional creak of a branch. I told myself it was all in my head, just my imagination running wild in the darkness. I focused on the path ahead, letting the rhythmic motion of walking soothe my nerves. The trail began to climb steeply, and I welcomed the burn in my legs as a distraction. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging up in the beam of my headlamp. About 2 hours in, I reached a small clearing with a view of the valley below. I paused to catch my breath and take in the sight. The town lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of how far I'd come. I felt a moment of pride, a sense of accomplishment, but the feeling was short-lived. As I stood there, a strange sound reached my ears. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it made my skin crawl. It sounded like a whistle, not the kind you hear from a bird or the wind, but a deliberate human whistle. 3 short notes repeated over and over. I froze, straining to hear. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving the forest in an oppressive silence. My heart was pounding now, and I forced myself to take slow, deep breaths. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe another hiker or a camper signaling their group. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. The trail was remote, and I hadn't seen a single car in the parking lot. I debated turning back, but the thought of retracing my steps in the dark felt even more daunting. I decided to keep moving, convincing myself that the sound had been a figment of my imagination. I checked my watch. If I kept a steady pace, I'd reach the end of the loop in another 3 hours. The trail grew narrower and more rugged as I pressed on. My headlamp cast eerie shadows on the trees, and every so often, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. The feeling of unease had settled into a low hum in the back of my mind, constant and gnawing. An hour later, I came across a fork in the trail. According to my map, both paths eventually led back to the parking lot, but one was longer and more scenic. I hesitated, then chose the shorter route. I wanted to be done with this hike as soon as possible. The shorter trail was steeper and rockier, forcing me to slow down. The forest here felt even denser, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. My headlamp flickered once, then again, and I cursed under my breath. I'd replaced the batteries before setting out, but the thought of losing my only light source made my stomach churn. As I rounded a bend, the trail opened up into another small clearing. In the center was an old, weathered picnic table, its wood splintered and moss-covered. Something about it felt out of place, like it didn't belong there. I stopped to take a sip of water and noticed something on the table, a small object, barely visible in the dim light. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached cautiously. It was a whistle, the kind you'd see a coach or a referee use. My mouth went dry. I stared at it, my mind racing. Was this some kind of prank? Or a coincidence? Neither explanation felt right. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It was cold to the touch, heavier than I expected. A sudden noise made me jump, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the trail behind me. Slow, deliberate steps crunching on the gravel. My heart leapt into my throat, and I spun around, shining my headlamp into the darkness. Nothing. The trail was empty, the forest silent. I stood there, paralyzed, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. But I couldn't move. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any sound, any sign of movement. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel it, the presence of something or someone just out of sight. Finally, my survival instincts kicked in. I dropped the whistle and started moving, walking as fast as I could without breaking into a full sprint. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I kept my eyes fixed on the trail, refusing to look back. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch sent a jolt of fear through me. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the final stretch of the trail. The parking lot was just ahead, and I could see my car through the trees. Relief washed over me, and I broke into a jog, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was out there. When I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly it took several tries to unlock the door. I threw my backpack in the back seat and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, my eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. But the forest was still, the trailhead quiet. As I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something standing in the road behind me. But there was nothing. By the time I reached the main road, the tension in my chest had eased slightly. I told myself I was safe now, that it was all over. But as I drove home, the events of the night replayed in my mind. The whistle, the footsteps, the overwhelming sense of being followed. It didn't make sense. None of it did. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window, double-checking each one before heading to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay there in the dark, every creak of the house setting my nerves on edge. And when I finally did drift off, I dreamed of the forest, of dark, winding trails and unseen watchers lurking just out of sight. I haven't been back to that trail since. I've told myself it was just my imagination, that there was nothing out there but the wind and the trees. But deep down, I know better. Something was out there that night, something I can't explain. And even now, I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching, waiting for me to return. I've always enjoyed hiking, the solitude, the fresh air, the connection to nature. It's my way of escaping the noise of the city, clearing my mind, and resetting. I've done dozens of solo hikes over the years, ranging from short day trips to multi-day treks. This time, I decided to tackle a trail I'd read about in a local hiking group, Raven Ridge. It wasn't officially marked on most maps, but the description said it offered stunning views and a real sense of wilderness. That sounded perfect. I started early on a Saturday morning. The sun was barely cresting the horizon as I parked my car at a small pull-off near the base of the ridge. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that makes you breathe a little deeper. I'd packed light but smart: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a knife, and a GPS tracker. My phone had limited signal out here, but I wasn't worried. The trail was supposed to loop back around to the starting point, and I had all day. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail wound through dense forest, the kind where the trees grow so close together that they block out most of the sunlight. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and the only sounds were the occasional bird calls and the crunch of my boots. I felt at ease, even a little invigorated. This was exactly what I'd been craving. As the trail climbed higher, the forest began to thin. The trees became smaller and sparser, giving way to rocky outcroppings and patches of low scrub. The views were stunning. I could see for miles. Rolling hills, a river snaking through the valley below, and distant mountains shrouded in mist. I stopped to take it all in, snapping a few photos with my phone before continuing on. Around noon, I reached a plateau where the trail split. There was no sign to indicate which path to take, but my GPS showed that both eventually looped back. One path looked well-trodden, the other less so. Feeling adventurous, I chose the less traveled route. It was narrower, with loose rocks and overgrown brush, but I figured it would make the hike more interesting. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. The sounds of the forest grew quieter, and the wind picked up, carrying a faint whistle as it moved through the rocks. It wasn't unsettling, not yet. If anything, it made me feel more connected to the wilderness around me. I stopped for lunch on a large boulder overlooking the valley, savoring the quiet as I ate a sandwich and drank some water. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me. That calm started to fade as the afternoon wore on. The trail became harder to follow. In some places, it seemed to disappear entirely, forcing me to rely on my GPS and my instincts. I've been hiking long enough to know how to navigate, but there's always a moment of doubt when the path ahead is uncertain. I reminded myself to stay calm and take it one step at a time. It was around 3 p.m. when I first noticed something odd. The air had changed. It wasn't the temperature or the wind, it was the smell. There was a faint, metallic tang that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't strong, but it was persistent, and it made me uneasy. I tried to ignore it and pressed on. The trail led me into a narrow canyon, its walls towering high on either side. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows that made the canyon feel claustrophobic. The smell grew stronger here, and I realized what it reminded me of: rust. It was as if the rocks themselves were bleeding iron into the air. I quickened my pace, eager to get through the canyon and back into open terrain. The ground was uneven, littered with loose stones that made footing treacherous. I slipped once, catching myself on a sharp rock that tore a small hole in my pants. My knee stung, but it wasn't bad enough to stop. I pressed on, the canyon walls slowly giving way to a more open area. That's when I saw it. In the middle of a clearing, there was a structure. It was old, made of weathered wood and rusted metal, and it looked completely out of place. It wasn't big, maybe the size of a small shed, but it was enough to make me stop in my tracks. Who would build something out here, and why? I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was ajar, hanging on broken hinges. Inside, it was dark, but I could make out the shapes of old tools and equipment scattered on the floor. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight. A strange feeling crept over me, a mix of curiosity and dread. I found a rusted saw, a cracked lantern, and a metal box filled with nails. There were no signs of recent activity, but the place didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused, as if whoever had been here had just stepped out and might return at any moment. I decided not to linger. The sun was getting lower, and I didn't want to be caught out here after dark. As I left the structure, I noticed something on the ground nearby. Footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, leading away from the shed and deeper into the wilderness. They didn't look fresh, but they also didn't look old enough to have been made years ago. My unease grew. I told myself they were probably from another hiker, maybe someone who'd stumbled across the shed like I had. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to head back the way I'd come, but the trail was harder to follow in the fading light. Shadows stretched across the ground, distorting the terrain and making everything look unfamiliar. My GPS was still working, but the signal was spotty, and I found myself second-guessing the route. Every noise, a rustling leaf, a distant bird call, made me jump. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A rhythmic tapping like metal against stone. I froze, straining to hear. Stopped, then started again, closer this time. My heart was racing. I couldn't see anything, but the sound was unmistakable. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I started moving as quickly as I could without running, my eyes darting around for any sign of movement. The trail was barely visible now, and I had to rely on my GPS more than ever. The tapping sound faded, but my sense of unease didn't. By the time I reached the edge of the canyon, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The sky was a deep orange, and the first stars were starting to appear. I felt a surge of relief when I recognized a section of the trail I'd passed earlier in the day. I was on the right path. The rest of the hike was a blur. I pushed myself hard, my legs burning and my lungs heaving. When I finally reached my car, it was full dark, and the moon was high in the sky. I threw my gear into the back seat and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and pulled onto the road. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly avoided something I couldn't explain and didn't want to understand. The shed, the footprints, the tapping, they all felt connected, but I didn't have the pieces to put the puzzle together. I haven't been back to Raven Ridge since. Every time I think about it, a chill runs down my spine. I still love hiking, but I've stuck to well-marked trails and busier routes since that day. Some might call me paranoid, but I'd rather be safe than risk whatever it was I stumbled into out there. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear a faint tapping in the back of my mind. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I'm not so sure. I had planned the hike for weeks. The weather forecast promised a clear day, and the trail I had chosen was one I'd read about in countless online forums. A remote path winding through dense forest and up a ridge that offered spectacular views of the valley below. It was supposed to be challenging but manageable, perfect for someone like me who wanted to push my limits without straying too far from safety. I packed my bag meticulously. Water bottles, energy bars, a lightweight rain jacket, a first aid kit, a map, and a GPS device. I even brought a small portable charger for my phone. I double-checked everything before I left, feeling a mix of excitement and nervous energy. This wasn't my first solo hike, but it was certainly the most ambitious one I'd attempted. The trailhead was a 2-hour drive from my apartment. I left before sunrise, sipping on coffee and listening to the hum of the engine as the dark highway stretched out in front of me. By the time I arrived, the sky was painted in soft hues of orange and pink. The parking lot was empty except for an old truck with mud-caked tires. I assumed it belonged to another hiker who had likely started earlier. The air was crisp and cool as I started walking. The trail was well marked, the dirt path cutting through a thicket of trees that towered above me. The morning light filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. I felt a sense of calm, the kind that only comes from being alone in nature. The first few miles were uneventful. The path meandered through the forest, gradually ascending as I made my way deeper into the wilderness. I paused occasionally to take a sip of water or snap a photo of the scenery. Birds chirped overhead, and I could hear the faint rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Everything felt alive, yet peaceful. About 2 hours in, I reached a fork in the trail. According to my map, the left path was the main route, while the right was a less traveled detour that eventually rejoined the main trail. Feeling adventurous, I decided to take the detour. It was supposed to add an extra mile or so to the hike, but promised more secluded views. The detour started off well enough. The path was narrower and less maintained, with roots and rocks jutting out, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. The forest here felt denser, the trees pressing in closer. The sunlight barely reached the ground, creating a cooler, almost eerie atmosphere. I noticed the sounds of the forest had changed, too. The birds were quieter, and the rustling in the underbrush seemed more sporadic, as if whatever animals were out there were keeping their distance. After about 20 minutes, I began to notice that the trail markers were becoming less frequent. At first, I brushed it off, thinking I might have missed a couple while focusing on my footing. But as I continued, I realized they had stopped appearing altogether. The path itself was still visible, though faint in some places. I pulled out my map and GPS to confirm my location. According to the GPS, I was still on the detour, but something felt off. The terrain didn't quite match what the map indicated. I debated turning back, but decided to push on a little further, reasoning that the trail would likely become clearer ahead. I marked my starting point on the GPS, just in case, and kept walking. The further I went, the less distinct the path became. The trees were thicker here, their gnarled roots crisscrossing the ground like a web. I had to slow my pace to avoid tripping. Then I saw it, a rusted metal sign, half buried in the undergrowth. The lettering was faded, but I could just make out the words, "Old Logging Road, Trail Not Maintained." I realized I had wandered onto an abandoned section of the forest. My heart sank, but I told myself it wasn't a big deal. I'd just retrace my steps to the main trail and continue from there. I turned around, but the path looked different going back. The faint trail I'd been following seemed to dissolve into the forest. I pulled out my GPS again, but the signal was weak, and it struggled to pinpoint my exact location. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I'd marked my starting point. Worst case scenario, I'd backtrack until I found my way. As I walked, I became increasingly aware of the silence. The usual forest sounds were gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. My breathing sounded loud in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around, but the forest was empty, just trees and shadows. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a clearing. It wasn't on my map, and the sight of it made my stomach drop. The clearing was small, surrounded by trees that loomed like sentinels. In the center was an old, dilapidated cabin. The wood was weathered and gray, the roof caved in on one side. A rusty axe leaned against a stump near the entrance. I stood there, unsure of what to do. The cabin wasn't marked on any of the maps I'd studied. It shouldn't have been here. A part of me wanted to investigate, to see if there was anything inside that could help me figure out where I was. But another part of me screamed to stay away. The place felt wrong, as if it didn't belong. I decided to leave. I'd find another way back to the main trail. I turned to head back into the forest, but the path I'd come from was gone. The trees seemed to have shifted, their trunks forming an impenetrable wall. My pulse quickened as I realized I was completely disoriented. I took a deep breath and tried to think logically. I had my map, my GPS, and my compass. I could navigate my way out. I pulled out the compass and oriented myself, choosing a direction that should lead me back to the main trail. I walked for what felt like hours, the forest growing darker as the sun dipped lower in the sky. My legs ached, and my water supply was dwindling. The unease I'd felt earlier had grown into full-blown fear. Just as I was about to stop and reassess, I stumbled upon another clearing. My heart sank as I realized it was the same one. The cabin stood in the center, unchanged. It was as if I'd been walking in circles. I'd heard of people getting lost and looping back to the same spot, but experiencing it firsthand was terrifying. I felt the weight of panic pressing down on me. I decided to set up camp. I still had some daylight left, and it would be safer to rest and wait for morning. I found a spot a little ways from the cabin and pitched my small tent. As I worked, I kept glancing toward the structure, half expecting to see movement, but it remained still and silent. That night was the longest of my life. The forest came alive with sounds, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, the distant hoot of an owl. Every noise set my nerves on edge. I barely slept, my mind racing with thoughts of what might be out there. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a wave of relief. I packed up quickly, determined to find my way back to the main trail. I used the sun to guide me, keeping it to my left as I walked. The forest seemed less oppressive in the daylight, but the sense of being watched remained. I tried to ignore it, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. After hours of walking, I finally stumbled onto a marked trail. The sight of the familiar blazes painted on the trees nearly brought me to tears. I checked my map and realized I was back on the main route, though much farther along than I'd expected. I was exhausted, but the knowledge that I was no longer lost gave me the strength to keep going. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun was low in the sky. My car was the only one there. I climbed inside and locked the doors, sitting in silence for a moment as the weight of the experience sank in. I'd made it out, but the memory of that cabin and the oppressive silence of the forest lingered in my mind. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been lucky. The wilderness is unpredictable, and getting lost can happen to anyone. It's a stark reminder of how small and vulnerable we are in the face of nature's vastness. I knew I'd hike again, but I'd be more cautious, more prepared. The forest had taught me a lesson I wouldn't soon forget. The early morning chill bit at my skin as I stepped out of my car, the parking lot empty save for my lone vehicle. The sky above was a soft, pale blue, streaked with the faintest hints of orange as the sun crept higher. The trailhead loomed ahead, the sign weathered but clear. Raven Ridge Trail, 15 miles round trip. I adjusted my pack, tugged on the straps to ensure it was secure, and set off. I'd been planning this hike for weeks, eager to escape the noise of the city and immerse myself in the solitude of nature. The first few miles were uneventful, the path winding gently through dense pines and oaks. The forest was alive with sound. Birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, the distant babble of a stream. I found my rhythm quickly, my boots crunching against the dirt and fallen leaves, my breathing steady. The trail was well marked, with small wooden signs and blazes painted on tree trunks to guide the way. It felt good to be out here, alone but not lonely, surrounded by nothing but the wild. About an hour in, I reached the first waypoint, a clearing with a wooden bench and a view of the valley below. The landscape stretched out before me, a patchwork of greens and browns, dotted with rocky outcrops. I paused to take a sip from my water bottle, savoring the stillness. The world felt vast and timeless here, the city and its demands a distant memory. Pressing on, the trail grew steeper, the terrain more rugged. The air grew cooler as I climbed higher, the trees thinning to reveal jagged cliffs and rocky ledges. I passed a group of deer grazing in a meadow, their ears twitching as they watched me pass. Further along, I spotted a hawk circling overhead, its piercing cry echoing through the hills. These moments of connection with the natural world were why I hiked, why I sought out trails like this. By midday, I reached the halfway point, a flat, rocky plateau with panoramic views of the surrounding mountains. I dropped my pack, stretching out my sore shoulders and legs, and pulled out my lunch. A simple sandwich, an apple, and a handful of trail mix. It wasn't much, but it tasted incredible out here, with the wind in my hair and the sun warming my skin. I lingered for a while, soaking in the beauty of the place, before reluctantly packing up and continuing on. The trail beyond the plateau was less maintained, the path narrower and more overgrown. Thorny bushes snagged at my pants, and the occasional fallen tree forced me to climb or detour. The silence here was heavier, the sounds of birds and insects fading as I ventured deeper into the wilderness. I checked my map and compass frequently, ensuring I stayed on course. The trail markers were fewer and farther between, and I didn't want to risk getting lost. As afternoon turned to evening, the sky began to change, the soft blues and whites giving way to deeper shades of orange and pink. The light filtered through the trees, casting long, dappled shadows across the forest floor. I was tired now, my legs aching from the constant uphill climb, but I knew I was close to my destination. A secluded viewpoint overlooking a hidden lake. The thought of the view kept me moving one step at a time. It was just past sunset when I reached the viewpoint. The lake below was a dark, shimmering expanse, framed by towering cliffs and dense forest. The air was cooler now, the breeze carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. I set up my small camping stove, boiling water for a quick dinner of instant noodles. The simple meal tasted like a feast as I sat on a flat rock, watching the stars emerge one by one in the deepening night sky. After eating, I unrolled my sleeping bag and lay back, gazing up at the stars. The Milky Way arched overhead, a luminous ribbon against the inky blackness. I felt small and insignificant under that vast sky, but also profoundly connected to the universe. It was moments like this that made the effort of the hike worthwhile. I must have dozed off because I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I couldn't figure out what had woken me. The night was still, the forest silent. I sat up, my breath visible in the cold air, and listened. There it was again, a faint rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. My pulse quickened as I scanned the darkness, my flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. The sound grew louder, closer. I gripped the flashlight tightly, my other hand instinctively reaching for the small knife I carried in my pack. My mind raced, trying to stay calm. Could be an animal, I told myself. A deer, a raccoon, maybe even a bear. I'd read about encounters like this before, and I knew the best course of action was to stay still and avoid startling the animal. But the sound wasn't what I'd expect from a four-legged creature. It was uneven, almost shuffling, with pauses that didn't make sense. My skin prickled with unease. I called out, my voice steady but firm, "Hey, who's there?" The rustling stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, flashlight in hand, every muscle tense. Minutes passed, or maybe it was only seconds. The forest around me was utterly still, as if holding its breath. Slowly, I backed away from the edge of the viewpoint, towards the center of the clearing where I'd set up camp. I kept the flashlight moving, sweeping the area for any sign of movement. Just as I was beginning to think it might have been my imagination, I heard it again, this time from a different direction. The shuffling was faster now, more deliberate, and definitely human. My stomach dropped. Someone was out here watching me. I tried to stay calm, focusing on my breathing. Panic wouldn't help. I needed to think. I packed up my gear as quickly and quietly as I could, my hands shaking. My mind raced through my options. Staying put didn't feel safe anymore, but hiking back in the dark was risky too. I decided to move, to put as much distance as I could between myself and whatever was out there. I kept my flashlight low, trying to avoid drawing attention, and started down the trail. The forest felt different at night, every shadow a potential threat. The trail was harder to follow, the blazes on the trees barely visible in the dim light. I forced myself to focus, to stay alert. The shuffling sounds faded as I moved, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the trail. My heart was still racing, but I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe I'd left whoever it was behind. That hope was short-lived. As I rounded a bend, my flashlight caught something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the trail. They were motionless, their features obscured by the darkness. I froze, my mind blank with fear. The figure took a step towards me, and that was enough to snap me into action. I turned and ran, my pack bouncing against my back, my flashlight beam wild and erratic. The trail blurred around me as I sprinted, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back, couldn't. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into another clearing. My legs gave out, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. My flashlight was still clutched in my hand, its beam flickering weakly. I scanned the edge of the clearing, half expecting the figure to appear, but the forest remained silent. I didn't sleep that night, I sat with my back against a tree, my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, waiting for dawn. When the first light of morning broke through the trees, I felt a wave of relief so intense it brought tears to my eyes. I didn't waste any time. I shouldered my pack and started down the trail, moving as quickly as I could without running. The parking lot was a sight for sore eyes. My car was still there, untouched. I threw my pack into the back seat and got in, locking the doors before starting the engine. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But the road remained empty. It wasn't until I was miles away, the forest a distant memory, that I finally let myself relax. I still don't know who or what was out there that night, and maybe I never will. But one thing is certain, I'll think twice before hiking alone again.